there are too many dedicated people right now, so we can really start. I will only say a couple of things about Manuela. She's a professor at the Institute for Sociology and Cultural Organization at Leuphana University Lüneburg, and is a member and one of the founding members of the Berlin Institute for Integration and Migration Research at Humboldt University in Berlin. She specializes on migration and racism in Europe and cultural theory. Her research focuses currently on issues of the changing conjunctures of racism in Europe, as well as on mobile labor and logistics in a digitized economy. So digitized labor, as you told me. Manuela Bojadžijev has paid particular attention to how the processes of racialization transform in globalizing contexts, including, for instance, citizenship, post-colonialism and post-socialism, media technology, the state, transnationalism, and popular culture. She is recently engaged in a project on the Chinese New Silk Road in Duisburg, together with Brett Nielsen and Ned Rossiter, her colleagues from Western Sydney University. She is also part of a research and art project on the Archive of Escape at the House of World Cultures in Berlin, together with many various people like Carolyn Emke, Joseph Vogel, Stephanie Schüller-Spingorum, and others. From 2013 to 2016, Manuela has been organizing a series of international summer schools at Humboldt University in Berlin, for example, with the entitled Teaching in Crisis, Expanding the Margins, Investigating Logistics. And what we know from yesterday, a conference on the 30th anniversary of the publication of the book Race, Class, Nation by Etienne Balibar and Immanuel Wallerstein, with the two of them, is underway and is planned for March 2018. And let me say something about Manuela's publications. Her major publications include a monograph on the history of migration in relation to migrants' practices of resistance and racism theory, and co-edited volumes, amongst others, on the transformation of the European migration regime in Southeast Europe, on critical accounts of Europeanization, on labor, migration and logistics. That one was published this year, and the handbook of racism theory in Germany, which is forthcoming. And her most recent articles and books chapters deal with the development of racism theory in Germany, of something about which we'll hear also today, the discourse of the refugee crisis after 2015, logistics as a perspective for migration studies, co-authored with Sandro Mezzadra, and virtual migration, labor, and racism, co-authored with Moritz Altenried. Today's lecture is entitled, Is Neo-Racism a Form of Violence of the Past? Conjunctures of Racism Theory. Manuela, the floor is yours, and thank you for coming.
Thank you, Adriana, very much, and thank you everyone for having me, and I really appreciate that you are here, although, you know, this is such an important day in this, in this city. So I hope you can bear with me and maybe share a couple of ideas that I have brought. Basically what I did was to decide to give you two instances of how racism theory in Germany developed. I think this is a particular history, and I will tell you a little bit more. Before I begin to do so, I would like to start to make several very brief observations. So the first one is that this is not my first visit to Belgrade in an academic or rather political context, and as both of my previous visits were related to the topic of my lecture, I would like to quickly mention them. Between 2003 and 2005, this was already mentioned by Adriana, I conducted research on migration in post-Yugoslavia within the framework of the Transit Migration Project, which took us to, among other sites, the UNHCR reception camp located in Motel Hiljadu Ruža on the edge of Belgrade, the deportation center, as well as Block 70, Block 70, shopping mall in Novi Beograd. Together with the American sound art group Ultra-Red, the project also resulted in an artistic treatment of the research design and findings. In many respects, the project anticipated the 2015 Balkan route and summer of migration. I returned to Belgrade in another context in early 2010, drawn by our interest in Yugoslavia's post-colonial history. The oversimplified idiom, mainly in post-colonial studies, thank you, of the West and the rest, generally understood as Europe and the rest, has produced, in my opinion, a narrowing of perspectives for post-colonial theories formulation. It became a sociolect, that is, a language brought forth by a specific group based on social factors. One of these factors was, quite simply, the collapse of the Yugoslavian project and the ensuing political, economic, and institutional limitations to intervening in the emerging international discussion on post-colonialism from this region, and to contributing relevant knowledge which would have challenged this debate's specific social act and the dominant notion that colonialism, as well as the struggle against it, had occurred exclusively outside of Europe. You will certainly know this much better than I, but this constellation even generated strange effects in the country I live in, Germany, that is to say, the West, which was never perceived as being outside of Germany, whereas former Yugoslavia is located in Europe, although its belonging to Europe always remained contested. It is perhaps unnecessary to explain why this interested me, but the project remained uncompleted. Secondly, I would like to say a few words concerning the title of my lecture. It is fairly ambivalent, as was my intention. It is sometimes claimed that racism is a form of violence of the past, as if racism were a kind of world historical revenant, a form of dead social dominance, which re-emerges through countless practices and discourses, but never undergoes actual renewal. An example for this is the debate on post-racism in the United States following Barack Obama's election to the presidency. David Theo Goldberg dedicated a book to the question called "Are We All Post-Racial Yet?", which sought to demonstrate how the invocation of post-racialism in fact signified the birth of a new form of racism. I may return to this point later on, but I want to begin by saying that any such flirtations with the notion of an end of racism were brought to an end by the election of Donald Trump and, at the very latest, the events in Charlottesville. A further meaning of the title, which certainly ties into the diagnosis of post-racialism, albeit in another way and from another point of departure, would be the perspective of an end of neo-racism as violence and its replacement by another form of racism, for which a name has yet to be found. For those unfamiliar with theories of racism, neo-racism denotes the mutations of racism which are no longer rooted in biological explanation of different human races, but rather explain racism through the existence of cultural differences. That said, biology does not necessarily disappear as the foundation of their line of argument, as some people still claim and live according to the notion that different human races actually exist, while at the same time culture is submitted to a paradoxical biologization, that is to say, is essentialized. It is important to understand here that this essentializing racism always explains itself and portrays itself as an explanation. As Etienne Palipar writes in Is There a Neo-Racism? And I quote, "In fact, what we see is a general displacement of the problematic. We now move from the theory of races or the struggle between the races in human history, whether based on biological or psychological principles, to a theory of race relations within society, which naturalizes not racial belonging but racist conduct. From the logical point of view, differentialist racism is a meta-racism, or what we might call a second-position racism, which presents itself as having drawn the lesson from the conflict between racism and anti-racism as a politically operational theory of the causes of social aggression. End of quote. Balibar's theoretical construction distinguishes itself by the notion that this racism consistently explains itself, which in turn makes thinking against racism so difficult. Because when we explain racism, we tend to reify its logic. So my third remark before I begin is the question of violence. German social theorist Heide Gerstenberger writes in the preface to her recent monumental and remarkable book, Markt und Gewalt, The Market and Violence, I quote, "A superficial look at the historical development of capitalist societies would suggest that the internal dynamic of capitalist economy drives towards removing direct violence from so-called market activity. Where this remained and continues to remain conspicuous, it is treated as an expression of a lower stage of capitalist development or as a deviation." End of quote. As could be expected, Gerstenberger rejects this view, arguing that capitalism by no means drives forward an objectification of economic relations. Instead, wherever such an objectification can be identified, it only emerged as a result of political struggle. This brings me to the violence of racism and how it can be understood. Does racism thus not in fact impede capitalism? Why should the imperative of the exploitation of labor power observe or adhere to racist criteria? Or alternatively, should we understand racism as being functional to capitalism? But did Michel Foucault not thoroughly ward us off a functionalist analysis of power and dominance? In light of this panorama and these questions, which are of course far too wide-ranging to adequately address in this context, I would first like to provide my comments with an analytical anchor. I have decided to approach these deliberations by laying out the development of critical racism theory in Germany. Although my own thinking is linked to this development, there is also another aspect which relates to both my theoretical as well as political perspective. I approach the analysis of dominance and power through the perspective of the critique thereof, whether theoretical or practical. As it were, the development of theories of racism in Germany is excellently suited to this task. So this is my operationist moment in some point. Okay. So I begin by an observation of the current situation in Germany. The narrowing of discourse around racism in the media and public sphere, as well as in many academic fields, was particularly pronounced in Germany for quite some time. Even the term racism itself was generally avoided, regarded by many as non-objective or unscientific. And of course, this has to do with Germany's history with fascism and anti-Semitism, and so racism was always, when it was mentioned, it was always directly related to this history, and therefore every other form of racism that you would like to analyze in this society would be somehow not allowed to discuss, because racism was exclusively for a long time understood as a part of the past. A softening of this negative attitude followed the 2011 revelations around the National Socialist Underground's killing spree, or rather around the entire complex which supported the actions of this right-wing terror network. I don't know if you have heard of it, but this terror network has killed 10 people over the course of around 10 years, and it was revelated in 2011. Federal Chancellor Angela Merkel mentioned racism quite explicitly at the memorial ceremony demanded by the victims' families and held in Berlin in February 2013. Barbara John, the former and first ever Federal Commissioner for Foreigners summoned to serve as an expert witness in the German Parliament's NSU Investigative Committee, called for, among other things, the establishment of a foundation against xenophobia and racism, arguing that one, I quote, cannot shy away from these terms, end of quote. In the media, meanwhile, cases of right-wing extremism and everyday racism are now giving coverage, and the institutional and legal foundation and forms of racism are investigated. Nevertheless, it became particularly evident during the NSU investigation that not talking about racism made it much more difficult to develop an analysis of the events. Bringing up institutional or everyday racism in state apparatuses, in kindergartens, schools, and in the academy, in the police and security services, but also in trade unions and political parties or the media, continues to meet with considerable resistance. Although a number of subjects talking about racism has risen and migrants on the whole occupy a larger public presence today than, for example, 10 years ago, it remains conspicuous how strenuously the latter avoids speaking about racism, particularly in public. Scientific studies are largely absent for the reason that analysis of racism is usually confronted with accusations of unscientificness from the outset. These accusations often include a lack of objectivity, exaggeration, and moralism. Such arguments tend to be of a circular nature, I would argue, as the majority of society seems to assume that racist violence or violent speech acts are by and large unrelated to and negligible in society at large. Racism is explained with recourse to other social, psychological, economic, cultural, or other negligible factors, in which turn produce negligible analysis and knowledge for political analysis, as well as in the medical, social, and cultural sciences. According to my line of argument, however, we are dealing not with a knowledge which is marginal to questions of social theory or society, but rather with marginalized spaces, as they remind us of the marginalization of those affected of racism in political and academic discourse, as well as in society as a whole. The analysis of racism so far has thus been, with reference to Foucault, concerned with subjugated thinking rather than established ideologies. Okay, now I would like to begin sketching out the development of racism theory in Germany through the example of the transnational exchange of racism theory between Germany and the UK during the 1970s and 1980s. That such an exchange could even occur may surprise some. During my visits to the UK, I often encountered the view that Germany lagged far behind the problematization and analysis of racism in terms of both its theorization as well as concrete racist violence. I by no means want to contradict the notion of a delay or lagging behind with view to racism discussions, as I think that this estimation is in fact correct in many, albeit not all, aspects. But instead of emphasizing the different contexts and conditions in both countries, which would require a study of their own, I'm interested in the resonance of racism debates between both localities extending into the present day. By resonances, I mean that between these localities, significant aspects of racism theory developed in harmony with one another. That is to say, articulated in and with the given specific local conditions and historical developments, albeit of their own accord. The exchange occurred explicitly and historically manifest, as well as in the form of a shared theoretical undertaking, which I intend to reconstruct here by way of two central concepts of the debate, which I consider relevant even today. The history of this exchange between the two localities can help us better understand the current state of our world and better situate ourselves within it. To briefly review, following the discrediting of biological concepts of race in the wake of World War II, a new cultural racism began to emerge, diagnosed by Frantz Fanon as early as 1956 in his lecture on racism and culture at the First International Congress of Negro Writers and Artists in Paris, as follows, I quote, "This racism that aspires to be rational, individual, genotypically and phenotypically determined becomes transformed into cultural racism." So this is 1956. Beginning in the 1970s, Birmingham's Center for Contemporary Cultural Studies further elaborated this thesis both empirically and theoretically. Worth mentioning here are the works on critical culturalism, difference and otherness by cultural studies protagonists like Stuart Hall, Paul Gilroy, Angela McRobbie, Celia Lurie, Hazel Carby, John Solomos, Paul Willis and others, which continue to influence academic debates on racism to this day. Characteristic of the Center for Contemporary Cultural Studies work is the 1982 collected volume The Empire Strikes Back, edited by the Race and Politics Working Group at the Center of Contemporary Cultural Studies, with the support and advice of Stuart Hall, who directed the center at the time. The introduction by John Solomos, Bob Findlay, Simon Jones, and Paul Gilroy bears the title, and I quote, "The Organic Crisis of British Capitalism and Race, the Experience of the 70s." And it seeks to build on the volume Policing the Crisis, published by Stuart Hall and others 3 years prior. In light of the contemporary European financial and debt crisis, which has since mutated into a veritable crisis of Europe today, with as yet unforeseeable outcomes, rereading this introduction proves quite inspiring. It not only seeks to conceptualize capitalism's recurrent crises, but also to renew Marxist theory beyond reductionist economism through the incorporation of an analysis of the categories of race and racism. So very much what Wallerstein and Balibar would do a couple of years later. In order to, and I quote, "emphasize the organic nature of the crisis, meaning by this that it is the result of the combined effect of economic, political, and ideological and cultural processes." The authors seek to, and I quote again, "introduce some discussion of race around which a fuller historical account may be constructed." It is striking that these discussions of race, by means of a critical theory of ideology, not only contributed to Marxist discussions of that period, but also became the foundation of their radical reinvention. An important reason for this may lie in the development of a theory of the state, tied to it and inspired by the work of, among others, Nikos Poulantzas and Klaus Offe, which sought to show, and I quote, "the way in which the crisis of the 70s was lived through race." End of quote. Although I will not be able to delve further into this topic here, I nevertheless would like to note an important point for the current need to understand racism within the framework of the European crisis in a new way, and to reflect on the characteristics, concepts, and possibilities of such a framework. The practices of exchange concerning the state of capitalism, race, and racism took place within the broader context of a newly defined and developing left project in Western Europe and North America, the so-called New Left. The Center for Contemporary Cultural Studies found themselves within this context in the western part of the world, a world locked in a geopolitical bloc confrontation, and contributed to this heterogeneous conglomerate of social and political movements through a renewal of Marxist thought. The European post-war generation began posing questions about its own future, and in Germany, protest initially emerged against nuclear weapons in the 1950s, including the West German women's peace movement, before later expanding to oppose the civil use of nuclear energy, which combined primarily with the social conflict around an unresolved fascism in post-war society and a series of anti-Semitic attacks in 1959. This consolidated over the course of the 1960s into engagement on behalf of anti-colonial struggles in the global South, feeding into protests against the Vietnam War. The exhibition, Was geht uns Algerien an? What do we care about Algeria? Depicting the Algerian uprising as well as the torture methods of French colonialism, was held at the Freie Universität Berlin in 1961 and later shown in other West German cities. The exhibition became the basis for a dispute with university and government institution and marked one of the New Left beginnings. By this point, Stuart Hall had laid the basis for the reception of the Center for Contemporary Cultural Studies work in Germany. Translation of 3 of his texts were published by the Argument Verlag publishing house, although one of these was based on an interview he gave to West German Public Radio in 1977. In the interview, Hall spoke about the work of the center, paying particular attention to the influence of Louis Althusser and Antonio Gramsci on the center's theory, as well as the development of a critical understanding of culture. Hall and his colleagues at the center sought to think more seriously about the relative autonomy of the ideological, the cultural, the political, and the economic in society without abandoning the goal of thinking about them as a complex unity. The other 2 contributions, published in the journal Das Argument, described by one of its founding editors, Wolfgang Fritz Haug, as the little sister of the New Left Review, addressed the development of a new understanding of ideology. From the outset, the publication sought to develop a critical theory of society and its own understanding of Marxism on the fringes of rather outside of the German academic landscape, where hardly any impulses toward critical education and social analysis could be found at the time. Wolfgang Fritz Haug helped to found the Ideologietheorie project in 1977, a working group which initially busied itself primarily with the theoretical tradition of Marx and Engels, Antonio Gramsci, Louis Althusser, and Stuart Hall, before building on this foundation to develop a material analysis as such. An intense discussion of anti-Semitism and fascism had preceded this debate, which, however, was in urgent need of conceptual expansion. It was in this context that theories of ideology, culture, and racism from not only the UK made their way to Germany. The process of exchange between 2 schools of racism theory, between the Center for Contemporary Cultural Studies and the milieu around the Argument Verlag, is central to my understanding of the period. One of the schools analyzed the historical setting and concrete manifestations of scientifically legitimized racism of the 19th century and fascist Germany with its expansive colonialism primarily within Europe, and was thus known to a German public for this reason. The other rested on the historical experience of British colonialism. Uniting both situations was the insertion of contemporary anti-colonial and decolonial struggles and the global South into the political conflicts of the global North, not least through the retortion effect unleashed by Southern migration movements into Europe. This effect resonates in the title of The Empire Strikes Back, and also finds expression in the migration struggles which contributed to translating the accumulated knowledge of these struggles into the Western New Left. Okay, the complex understanding of a capitalist social formation as represented by both the Center for Contemporary Cultural Studies and the Ideologietheorie project implies a distinction vis-à-vis all stripes of orthodox Marxism and party communism, and was simultaneously connected to the ambitious goal of renewing Marxism. The engagement toward a critical understanding of ideology led to a critical understanding of racism and sexism in capitalist society, which the race and politics groups at the Center for Contemporary Cultural Studies sought to develop further. Paul Gilroy writes in his contribution to The Empire Strikes Back, titled Race, Class and Autonomy, and I quote, "We are fully aware that the ideological status of the concept race qualifies its analytical use. It is precisely this meaninglessness which persistently refers us to the construction, mobilization, and pertinence of different forms of racist ideology and structuralization in specific historical circumstances. We must examine the role of these ideologies in the complex articulation of classes in a social formation and strive to discover the conditions of existence which permit the constitution of black people in politics, ideology, and economic life. Thus, there can be no general theory of race or race relations situations, only the historical resonance of racist ideologies and a specific ideological struggle by means of which real structural phenomena are misrecognized and distorted in the prisms of race. This rejection of an all-encompassing theory of racism would evoke a response from Wolfgang Fritz Haug 15 years later when he warned, against the backdrop of rising nationalism and racism following German reunification, of ascribing a mystical meaning to the word racism and ignoring the problem of universalism. As one of the protagonists who helped to bring British discussions on racism to Germany, he was keenly aware that, and I quote, "We must exercise caution in the transfer of theorems." End of quote. Comparing the respective orientations of the Center for Contemporary Cultural Studies and the Ideologietheorie project, we can conclude that the center primarily observed the modalities of capacities for action, while Ideologietheorie exhibited a stronger focus on aspects of dominance and rule. For both schools, racism theory is primarily a question of the conception and strengthening of anti-racism and a critical perspective on racism. In his discussion of Valentin Voloshinov's Marxism and the Philosophy of Language, first published in Russian in 1929, while English and German translations would not appear until 73 and 75, found in The Empire Strikes Back, Paul Gilroy defines anti-racism as a praxis which, I quote, challenges the status of visible differences designated racial, end of quote. Here, he begins to develop an understanding of racism, which he would later flesh out under the title Against Race, Imagining Political Culture Beyond the Color Line. In 1982, he diagnosed that anti-racism takes on significance where, I quote, the oppressed negate the very categories of their oppression, revealing that these categories mark sites and boundaries of class struggle in ideology where they create cultures of resistance, end of quote. As if in direct reference to this argument, Wolfgang Fritz Haug would write 3 years later, I quote, "Anti-racism exists as little as racism as such exists. Rather, it only exists to the extent it is politically constructed." This leads us to the question of the politics of this construction. What do we do when certain problematics are defined as racism, thereby combining different characteristics and projecting them as united? The relation is complex. The anti-racist construes the racist as the one who construes race. We must be careful not to get stuck in this trap where the racist can even formally occupy the discourse position of the anti-racist. End of quote. And I think this is a very important quote and consideration, because what we see today is that many of the racist arguments are actually formulated as an argument against racism, from Erdogan to Donald Trump. In his deliberations, Haug refers to John Solomon's noteworthy 1986 text, Varieties of Marxist Conception of Race, Class and the State, a Critical Analysis. Translated into German the same year, this essay follows a definition of racism which is reductionist neither in theoretical nor political terms, but rather establishes the foundation for a combination of Marxism and racism analysis, which again became prominent with the original French publication of Balibar's and Wallerstein's Race, Class, Nation in 1988. The common point of departure for both the Center for Contemporary Cultural Studies as well as the Ideologietheorie project was the notion that knowledge is embedded in the historical, but depends on categorical preconditions which provide it with consistency. In order to develop this theoretically, he began to work out a concept of articulation defined in the introduction of The Empire Strikes Back as, I quote, a concept which means that race joins together the various elements of the organic crisis in the ways in which they are experienced, but also that it gives expression at the political and ideological levels to specific forms of control aimed at black people. End of quote. The notion of articulation served to operationalize the analysis of class relations in a broader social context in order to analyze the contingent and heterogeneous state of the social as such. There are many differences aside, which I cannot explore further here. The work of Louis Althusser, Etienne Balibar, Gilles Deleuze, Félix Guattari in France, Ernesto Laclau and Stuart Hall in the UK, as well as Alex Demirovic, Nora Ritzel and Joost Müller in Germany, are all connected to this approach. Working out a concept of articulation implied what one could call a heretical operation on the edges of Marxist thought, albeit without giving up on the idea of an all-encompassing socialization through capitalism. It is thus little surprise that the volume The Empire Strikes Back was an attempt, as a result of the articulation of different discursive elements, material practices and historical anchorings, to conceptualize the link between British capitalism and race. The term articulation resonated in various localities simultaneously and was clearly capable of taking up and making translatable epochal problems of both political and conceptual nature, which many found themselves confronted with at the time, insofar as it made both the multiplicity as well as the singularity of situations resources of analysis. I am convinced that the working out of the concept of European racism, as spoken of by Etienne Balibar, rests on these earlier efforts and articulates two formations with one another. One reflecting the colonial and fascist past which produced and formed Europe, the other pointing to the resistance which colonialism and fascism met in European history. The emphasis on the complexity and heterogeneity of the social helped and continues to help understand the development of racisms in Europe without losing sight of their specific articulations. Particularly in times when the European project is undergoing an intensification of crisis and crisis management, a potential new materialist foundation of debates on race and racism would benefit enormously from taking up not only the debates of the 70s and 80s, but also the discussions of the 1990s, in which the Institute for Social Research in Frankfurt and the work of Alex Demirovic played a central role. So now I move to that other part and instance of the development of that history of racism theory. The Institute for Social Research was the first to launch a series of empirical and theoretical studies on right-wing extremism and racism in the early 1990s. These included an investigation of racist attitudes among highly qualified service sector employees in Frankfurt, a city which not only viewed itself as multicultural, but was the first German city to institutionalize such an understanding in the form of the Office for Multicultural Affairs in 1989. Another study was devoted to conflicts between German and migrant workers in waste disposal, while another analyzed the limits of state intervention against right-wing extremist tendencies among police. In the early summer of 1993, an institute working group led by Alex Demirovic began discussing the question of whether the new right, which has become popular again or talked about again, forming on the basis of intense engagement with the theories of the left and in critical distance to older right-wing groups, could popularize itself and make inroads into intellectual milieus in Germany. This in turn led to a research project led by Demirovic and Gerd Paul on right-wing thought and democratic self-understanding among students in universities. Against the backdrop of growing nationalism, right-wing radicalism and racism in the course of German reunification and the pogroms in Hoyerswerda, Rostock and elsewhere, the Institute, in the tradition of critical theory and noted for its work on anti-Semitism in the discursive field at hand, saw itself as obliged to, and I quote, contribute to the better understanding of causes and effects, end of quote. Although it began its work comparatively early, the Institute was not alone in the endeavor at the time. Elsewhere, congresses were organized, research projects conducted, and discussion contributions published. One of the Institute's central concerns was to work toward a conceptual clarification in order to be able to even speak about racism in the first place. The concept was largely considered taboo, with terms like xenophobia or group-focused enmity and disintegration being used instead. This was rooted in a passionately conducted, sometimes conflictive debate about the state of research, both in terms of conceptual analysis as well as the design of concrete investigations. The debate was related to the development and positioning of new research agendas for the Institute for Social Research. In other words, whether racism ought to be a category of social analysis, what effects racism had on politics, society and culture, and what influence a form of racism directed against migrants, refugees and undocumented people had on social relations in a democracy. A central aspect of this debate was the discussion, relevant even today, about an essentialist or rather anti-essentialist understanding of race and ethnicity, whereby the respective understanding had implications not only for the conception of analysis and research, but for anti-racist politics as a whole. In Germany, this may have to do with the fact that the debate around racism and anti-racism took place against the backdrop of the National Socialist past and anti-Semitism, although the contemporary context of labor migration and primarily refugee movements since the 1980s were also critical. Analysis of the construction of ethnicity engaged with the possibilities and limits of analogies to anti-Semitism and processes of racialization. Yet, characteristically, there exists no conceptual equivalent between racism in relation to ethnicity to this date. It is more the case that the decision to retain the term racism was made precisely because construing analogies led to confusion and thus evoked questions which will be made productive here. The constellation corresponds to a conceptual shift in racism in the late 1980s and early 1990s, with the emergence of neo-racism deploying a co-culturalist line of argument, that is to say, a racism without races. I consider this to be a particular strength of approaches to social theory and social critique in Germany, that is, to insist on the conceptual unity of racism, in contrast to a unifying concept in relation to racism. Not only despite, but precisely because of the heterogeneity and bulkiness of historically inherited racism formations, as it allowed for such a theoretically complex arguing theory of racism to be put forward. Demirovic's project to connect critical theory and post-structuralism, and particularly the connection between ideology critique and ideology theory, also belongs to the social and racism theory work of the late 80s and early 90s. Demirovic strengthened the interstice between these two theoretical currents through a concretizing approach and the incorporation of three further elements taken from post-structuralist theory and made fruitful for an understanding of racism. Firstly, the centrality of discourses and relations of representation for social relations shaped by racism, the analysis of which allowed the working out of more socially dynamic categories for processes of racialization, thus emphasizing social conflicts over a dominance functionally conceptualized form of subjugation. Secondly, an investigation of historical context, which inquires as to how racialized identities are imaginatively and performatively constituted, through which institution and apparatuses, like schools and families, it is fostered or limited. That is, making the constitution of subjects and their subjectifications in shifting political processes comprehensible. And thirdly, the investigation of biopolitical technologies through which the generative behavior and social endogamy of the population is regulated on both the macro and micro levels, thus producing knowledge of populations and making it the foundation for the governance of populations. With reference to Pierre-André Taguieff and Etienne Balibar, Demirovich adopted the deliberations on neo-racism as generalized anti-Semitism from critical theory. This had decisive implications for a conception of racism which made resistance to racism the foundation of analysis rather than the subjugated, racialized subjects. Three aspects characterize this project. Firstly, race must be identified as an ideological construct which marks an imaginary genealogical schematic. Race, however, cannot be an empirical social category, nor can we assume the existence of human races. This is connected to a shift in perspective which places the burden of epistemological proof on the side of the dominant. As Demirovich argues with reference to Adorno and Horkheimer's dialectic of enlightenment, I quote, that Jews are seen as a race is, in Horkheimer's and Adorno's view, a doctrine propagated by the Nazis, which is not true as such, but which became true in horrible fashion, insofar as fascism made it true. End of quote. This shift of perspective carries implications for social theory. Not only is racist discourse or an ethnocentric attitude made the foundation of investigations for our understanding of racism, so much as it marks an all-encompassing social relation, as the continuity of racist ideology also requires explanation. Secondly, it means that despite different manifestations of racism, the unity of the concept of racism can be retained in order to proceed from central elements of racism marked by continuity, even and particularly when, as historically occurring, not only the word race, but also the statements connected to it are censored and obscured, or rather when their context of meaning is utterly transformed, as in the case of neo-racism. Thirdly, it concerns a concrete investigation of the specific historical situations, formations, and conjunctures of racism. Conjunctures of Racism would also then be the title of a collected volume 10 years later, which brought together papers from the April 2001 Institute for Social Research conference, which sought to self-reflectively investigate critical racism theory. The immediate impetus for the gathering was the February 2000 formation of a governing coalition between the Austrian People's Party, under the leadership of the new Chancellor Wolfgang Schüssel, and the right populist Austrian Freedom Party, led by, at that time, Jörg Haider, along with the broad mobilizations against the coalition across Austrian society. So something, very relevant today. This event seemed to suggest that racist ideology was changing and by no means always remained the same and stable. Instead, concrete investigations could be made into how racism shifts in its internal logic, takes on other forms, and, as in the case of new Austrian government, links up with unexpected practices. Ultimately, forms and practices against racism could also be integrated into a determination of the conjuncture in order to better understand the contemporary balance of social forces. The attempt to determine the balance of forces largely related to academic discourses. In the aforementioned preface to the collected volume Rechtsextremismus und Fremdenfeindlichkeit, so right-wing extremism and xenophobia, Demirovic analyzes prevalent academic racism discourse at a period in which he identifies 6 axes of conflict along which positions polarize symptomatically. And I should say the volume was called Right-Wing Extremism and Xenophobia because the director of that time did not allow it to be called racism because he was one within the institute who didn't want it to be called racism, but he wanted to distinguish it from that tradition. And that's why this very, theoretically unsavvy term, Fremdenfeindlichkeit, Xenophobia, appeared in the title. The 6 axes of confrontation pertain the thesis and counter-thesis concerning the motives of far-right perpetrators, the analysis between ideology on the one hand and anomie on the other, which we have today as well. So people who, this is how racism explained, it's the anomie of certain groups of people from a society. The second about the social-spatial dimension of right-wing radicalism, so authoritarian elites versus mass revolt, same we have today. The historical dimension, regression into pre-democratic orientations versus the risks of a multicultural society, same argument today. The causes of far-right violence, distribution conflict or identity conflict, same today. And lastly, the question as to how to deal with the violence, or rather the perpetrators thereof. And again, this is a communication that we have, a dialogue that we have today. There are some people who say we need to communicate with them, and the others say we need to exclude them. According to Demirovic, these polarizations are precisely what suggests the possibility of an either-or position in the debate, albeit one which is not appropriate to the complex nature of the problematic. A polarization which has joined the fray in the last decade, less so in the academic description of the subject so much as within the field of investigation itself, could be added to this list. Namely, we can observe a growing religious articulation of social inequality, overdetermined by a racist discourse and accompanied by the formation of authoritarian collectives which foster catastrophic, indeed Manichaean polarizations into good versus evil. Such a polarization already began to emerge in the context of discussions around Islam in the European migration societies of the 1980s, but grew massively in the wake of 9/11 attacks and the new forms of warfare, no longer between states, and reorientation of geopolitical and geospatial constellation, extending deep into everyday life. We all operate within the discursive automatisms prevalent in current discussions. See, for example, the debate around headscarves or mosque construction in European cities. As ideological preconstructs, ideologeme, one could say, which develop a degree of self-evidence. Worth noting in the current discussion is the tendency towards a moral mining of the discursive field, a tendency towards identity formation constructed via values and norms, which in turn is indicative of an authoritarian constellation. This systematic inventory of aspects, criteria, and approaches in the debate could essentially be read as a research program which remains unfulfilled to this day. Unfulfilled because the many aforementioned polarizations continue to occur, albeit in rearticulated form. Had they been intensified in the last decades, the discussion and investigation of racism as well as the development of racism theory would nevertheless by no means have brought forth discursive sovereignty in a direction, nor been in a position to resolve the social polarizations, or rather false contradictions. This was also the subject of the collected volume on Conjunctures of Racism following the workshop at the Institute for Social Research. It is nevertheless disconcerting that we clearly are still confronted with many of the old questions without having recourse to a repertoire of critical studies which not only objectify a discussion of racism, but which could also demoralize it. In a globalized world in which new ascriptions and affinities play a growing role in everyday life, it is vital to renew these theoretical insights and expand them with empirical investigations from a critical perspective alongside their conceptual and theoretical focus. Such a democratically orientated kind of work implies a vision that racism as a social relation can also be ended. It is about, in the words of Donna Haraway, I quote, "the utopian dream of the hope for a monstrous world without gender," and I add, race. Monstrous because such a world would necessarily be more inventive and creative than the unbearable division according to ethnicity, race, culture, and people we live and experience today. Thank you very much.
Wonderful ending. Thank you, Manuela. Tell us something. The floor is open. Questions, ideas, suggestions, or should I break the ice? Okay, you do that. Maybe we can also use this mic because we have one. She's not there, so I will bring this one.
Thank you for this great talk, and it's illuminating. So, I have two questions just to clarify a little bit because I don't work in Europe as much, so I'm not really familiar with the discourses on race and anti-racism.
Yeah.
But when you talk about Trump and you made the example that the racist appropriates the anti-racist discourse, so what exactly did you mean? And so I'm just curious to if you can elaborate a little bit as to how that discourse works exactly. And my second question, not to be killjoy, but so yes, utopian thinking is necessary and everything, but I'm wondering to what extent psychoanalysis can help us here, because I think that the psyche is also a problem in a sense that, you know, if you say at the end race is a social relation, and if we can figure out a way to get out of that social relation, or in a sense to erase, abolish, I mean, all of these very popular terms these days. So what do we do with the psyche?
Do you want us to collect the questions or?
No, this is enough. So maybe Trump is not the best example. A really good example is Erdogan. I mean, I don't know if you have followed this because these are the particularities between two countries that are related through migration. And so Turkey and Germany had this debate over the course of many months this year, which had to do with, you know, a lot of political issues going on at the same time. But in general, Erdogan would be using arguments in his political speeches against Germany, where he accused the German government of being racist towards the Turkish population in Germany, which, you know, you cannot say anything else, but that is true. But he was using it to actually justify an authoritarian government in Turkey. He was also at the same time saying that you could see the way Germany behaves towards Turkey is the very same way that Germany behaved during the time of colonialism against the African population by eliminating it. Okay? So he would use, you know, arguments from post-colonialism, from post-colonial struggles, and use them again to legitimize an authoritarian, racist regime, and you could even say it's colonial in some respects. Okay. This is one example. The other example, obviously, is the feminist discussion. The whole discussion on how people who are right-wingers stand up for the rights of women against migrants and them being rapist and women having to wear headscarves and, the whole discussion against Islam. I mean, here you have people who have, when it came to, a bettering of laws which refer or relate to violence that is, within families, yeah, who for years have tried to avoid that these laws would be renewed and bettered in terms of gender relations and for the rights of women, stood up and gave all the speeches about how feminist and how egalitarian in terms of gender relations Germany is in relations to these new populations who are entering it. So this is something that you find, this is, I think, not only in the realm of racism, but also in other realms of society. It is really impressive how the right recuperates a long history of struggles and uses it for their own purposes. And not only in discourses, but also in the way of practices. So for the first time, we were able to observe this in the early 2000s when, collecting signatures, you may think whatever you think of the practice of collecting signatures, but the collecting of signatures on streets has always been a practice of the left. The right never went to the streets, after post-World War II in Germany. It was the moment where the government of the Social Democrats and the Green Party tried to introduce a new citizenship law that the right party, the CDU, went to the streets and collected millions of signatures for for integration against double citizenship. Okay? And the people, of course, understood what they were doing. They were not for integration. They went to these stands and said, where can I sign against the migrants? Okay? So, of course, everyone knows what they are doing, but and then you have the so-called identitarian movement at the moment, very, popular in Austria, but also in Germany. They do these spectacular actions now. They have, for example, organized a boat on the Mediterranean this summer to try to stop migrants to cross the Mediterranean. Yeah, and so these are actions, usually unseen. This is really like, I don't want to draw this connection, but I'm drawing this connection to fascism, to fascist youth movement that we can see coming out. So I think there is something to that we need to, understand in how this works. And is that a recuperation, or is there another way to understand this? That would be a question I would have for you. The other thing is, I would definitely insist that, many of racism theory, at least of what I know, seems to have given up on the idea that we can have an end of racism. I don't want to give that up. This is maybe my normative political position. I'm not giving this up because I think also that the way we can theorize these things is actually only through the horizon or with the horizon of an end of this. And this is why I deeply believe in, the theorizing of racism as a social relations in, analogously like the gender relations paradigm, if you will, So it's not about, getting rid of a group of people. The matter is more complicated than this. The matter is a social relation. The other aspect of your question, the question of the psyche, I cannot answer this because I have never worked on these issues, and it's a part that it's not something that I'm occupied with. But I definitely believe also in my historical empirical research, whenever I saw practices against racism being successful, it was always when people were able to change the constellation of a social relation, where people were actually able to not be what they were when they entered the struggle. And this is, and therefore, racism is not and that makes it so complicated. We cannot reify these ideas about, the black and white and the Jews and the Germans and all of this. We need to get rid of these terminology, but we have to go through it by changing the relations between these groups in which they will dissolve, apparently. And this is not utopian. I think this can historically be shown how it actually works in particular situation, and where these situations are, not in general, showing an end to racism, but in a particular situation can absolutely create a better situation for the people. And I think that's worth it.
It's hard when the U.S. administration becomes feminist in the war against Afghanistan, or when Ali Schwarzer becomes the greatest ally of the right wingers.
Yeah.
You don't know what to do. I'm talking about gender, but it also introduces the racial dimension of how Islam is being racialized.
Yeah.
Misha Kapitanovic has a question. Yes,
I think it's for the recording.
I'm just gonna try to be as simple as possible, but I'm having a conceptual problem here.
Okay.
And I'm speaking this as someone with background in culture studies and global historiography. And my problem is, how can we speak about racism in universal terms? Because what I was listening I'm not sure that I grasped all the ideas well or all the arguments well, but what I listened here, first of all, that major backbone of theory that was used were European white men. Correct me if I'm wrong, like minus Stuart Hall, right? And then other problem that I saw was huge difference between continental European and North American legal history, where in Europe we don't acknowledge race as legal term based on Council of Europe's declarations that were ratified by most of our governments, while in the US race is legal category. And then very sensitive local contexts which are so different in all of our space. I'm going to be very short and maybe just put 4 of them, like the US, Germany, the UK, and Bosnia. In Bosnia, easy, we only have us, majority, and Roma, and we construct them as race. In Germany, there is no race, but then there is so many people that are not Germans. Then in the UK, maybe I'll leave the UK for the rest, for the end, but then we have the US, which is race is a knowledge and exists, and there's so many races, and there's even there were jokes like Chinegro and all these like mixed race sort of identities that are emerging. And then Britain, where situation completely sort of reversed. And what I mean here is just short situation. When I was in supermarket after Trump won elections in London, and I was buying, and there was a African Caribbean woman selling stuff, and then she was talking with everyone how horrible situation is, and then she told me how isn't this disaster, isn't the world falling apart? And I said, well, my big elections happen in June, meaning on Brexit, and meaning I'm East European and I'm gonna get, and then she just got quiet. And this was illustrative for me that if you're Black British, your situation was not as bad, and you could have your cheap talk about Trump. But if you were non-British East European, this complicates things on so many levels. So just to repeat the question again, how can we universalize the concepts here?
Well, I think that's an incredibly important question, and I'm struggling with it. But I would insist. that we have to. Let me begin by saying off record, actually, that the people I have quoted may appear as white Europeans, but there was a time where the Jewish people were not so much considered as white Europeans. Okay? So that, that somehow complicates things, and I think we have to be very cautious when, addressing people as this and that, and having the right to say this or that.
I'm referring to dead white men.
Yeah, okay. Again, I think, I'm quite attentive to these things, I believe, but I think that we should not, I think, I like my dad's white men. They have taught me a lot, so I will continue to use them, and I have learned from every other, group, you name them, a lot too, and I have no intention to somehow. I feel I have contributed a lot to make this different. A, B, maybe I have not so successfully. C, I think maybe this sounds banal and stupid and maybe even naive, but I'm really interested in the argument. I really want to have an argument. And so, yes, I can listen to people in different ways, and I am sure, and the historical history tells me that there are certain knowledge epistemics that you can only understand from a certain subject position, but that doesn't necessarily make the subject position a right subject position. And what I am particularly interested is processes of solidarity. So, again, I believe that racism is a social relation, which means that we can only overcome racism if there is a solidarity of the Germans with the Jews, of the whites with the blacks, of the non-migrant with the migrant, etc., etc. And this, and here I am with your argument, and I absolutely agree. I think this is why I have used the word conjuncture, and I've said that within the history of racism, and I'm particularly interested in this because the exemplifications, the variations, the phenomena, etc., appears completely different in completely different contexts. South Africa, Germany, China, Japan, you name it, it completely is different. So, and I think even, historically different. So, anti-Semitism is really vibrant in Germany today, but it's probably not the most dominant form of racism at the moment, And I'm not saying, I don't want to hierarchize it, but it's a matter of, and only if we have a conceptual unity of racism, we are able to actually conceptually understand the relations between and resonances between these different forms of oppression that I think we are still allowed to call them racism. So then you could ask, and I was always interested in that question, and I think Balibar also is. In some of his writings, he actually asked this question, and he says, so what allows us to speak of all these different phenomena as racism? Yeah. And of course, I have a political interest. That's what I already said. I need to have a conceptual unity of this, because otherwise I cannot understand the relation, and I cannot understand the historical conjunctures and the particular situations. But of course, and here I come to the core of your question, I think there are a few conceptual dimensions that probably are very, very, very general and abstract, but that allow me to speak of racism in different places in the world, that then needs to be historically, understood. One of them being that it is definitely a form of domination. The other is it's based on taxonomies, so it's organizing categories in relation and hierarchizing them, and it's based on a genealogical scheme. And this is very important. It means you inherit something when you come out of this group. And this allows me, for example, other than we speak of, for example, anti, I don't know how you could call that here, anti-Ziganismus, yeah? So racism against Roma, okay? Anti-Semitism, anti-Islamism, anti-Slavism, anti-migrantism, and you have these people who write books about all these forms of racism, and then they say racism is between black and white people, and everything else is about this. I think the problematic, and that's why I like the work of the critical theory school is, and that's why I quoted this thing about the Jews, is that if we take this seriously, conceptually, the idea that of Adorno and Horkheimer, that actually it is fascism that invents the Jew, then this means, theoretically, that every other group that is organized in terms of racist relation is an invented group. And then it does mean that the construction of it is not only a construction, but it's a social construction. And what we have heard a lot is the matter of construction, but what we seldom hear is what does it mean that it's socially constructed. So what is the social in the construction? And that is something which then goes back to the conjuncture. So I think we have, this is what I would say are the dimensions of this theoretical unity. And then it's very specific. The UK, I think you gave the best example. I was in the UK in 2007, and I saw the people from Poland, Portugal, and the Kurdish people, etc. And within UK racism theory, there was an inability to address this as racism. And, again, off record, I really don't want to have this online. I think this contributed to the Brexit, because they are unable to understand this as a social conflict that is determined by a racist view of the world. And it made them unable to confront it. They don't have the language for it. And for me this was obvious, and I know that, I had nothing to say at that time. I was running about and I was saying these things, and people look at me and, I end up being white, and that's it. And that's the problem, And my interest, very simply, is that I would like to, this is a problem of domination. And it's addressed in very different contexts. Bosnia, here, there, South Africa. Take South Africa as an example. Again, off record. Because this is so morally contagious. It's, you have a migration from African countries to South Africa. You have a mobilization against them. People are being killed. Okay? This is not called racism in South Africa. And I know why. Because the fight against apartheid was so important, and it still is until today. And I don't want to diminish it at all, but this is the vocabulary of the struggle. So if you then use the same vocabulary in which you have fought decades and centuries of domination, and you then begin to use it for another case, you lose an argument. And that's a problem. So again, that's why all these terminologies are extremely important. And we talk about racisms. There's a variety of vocabularies and grammars in the way you discuss these issues. But I think there's unity to them.
Davide?
Thank you. Just two quick questions. So I'm perfectly right with the need of something, a concept or framework that allows you to grasp, to capture different manifestations. So I would like you to to expand a little bit on the three elements, I think you mentioned about races which are distinctive. So the first point is just, could you expand a little bit me, just say something more on these three elements about distinctive or races. That's the first point. And the second point is, I didn't get something. So you said we should use the term racism and not other terms. The first reason is eminently political. There are political reasons to do that. I think you can understand perfectly. The other, is there or not theoretical reasons too? I mean, you said sometimes it seems that other terms capture the same phenomena but with another term, and in other times it seems that no, you're not able to capture the same phenomena, so you're not enough encompassing. I don't know if it's clear what I want to say.
No, absolutely, that's a very good question, and I'm not sure I can give a general answer. To the first, I think one example is, that is quite important to understand that, of course, I think the issue of the issue of time is really important here. So if you, for example, take the racism against migrants in Europe, okay, that's a very wide field. But if you think of the struggles in the banlieues, if you think about racism against certain groups of migrants in Germany, if you think of, so then I think what is important is that, and then I think someone asked that how racism is actually institutionalized. It is. The way, in Germany, you are a migrant when you come. After a while, you can become a German. This is already organized within the citizenship law. But your name is still in the so-called Ausländerzentralregister, which is the foreigner's central register. Okay? This means that even if you are naturalized as German, you are still considered to be foreign-born. Okay? And then there's an additional category which is called migration background, which means that even in the second generation of migration, you are still a migrant, even if you haven't had any migration experience yourself. Okay? That means you are basically trapped in a genealogical concept because you are born to migrants, and therefore you are considered to be migrants. This is different, I would say, than, for example, if you are in a family that was, that came to the US through slavery. Because, of course, the institutionalization of racism within the US history is much more, in terms of time, it is much more continuous up until today. And of course, it is not only in a way, it also includes structural racism in terms of the likelihood of living in a poor area and being poor. Okay, so these are the structural determinations, and these are analog to migration in Europe, but they are of course very different, and they have other temporalities. So at some point, the Polish population that came to Germany after the First World War, most of their names have been Germanized. They are not really considered anymore as the Polish people. There is a knowledge of this history, but not so much. So, after a while, you can become that. Not necessarily all of the people, but some people can. So I'm not saying, it cannot, it always exists, and you are always part of this genealogy. You can, it can, for some people, it can more easily dissolve as a genealogy than for others. And this is important. And then the theoretical question would be, is this the same? Is that then the same racism? Okay, I think this poses question to the theoretical concept as well. In terms of the theoretical and the political, I think that in the German context, I would insist on the term racism, but I'm well aware that, as I gave the example of South Africa, that in other contexts it may be different and be politically relevant to do it differently. The question then comes up: how are we talking to one another on a global scale if we fight against, what I would call racism, and what may be called differently in other contexts?
I would have two questions if there's no other hands. Okay.
That can I ask when later?
Okay, thank you. My one question is related to the issue of critique and violence, and the other question is related to the issue of what is more real. Now, it came up during the discussion yesterday evening after the third session, and maybe you've heard. I think Georgia and Jelena were discussing what was more real, race or nation, in terms of race, nation, class. And I remember, and now again it pops up, in terms of construction and what is constructed and real. This is the old debate. But what was for me very strange yesterday was the idea that the nation was more real than the race. Of course, talking about race is in this context reducible to the skin color and skin color. But Jelena said that nation was more real because you had nation as a legal entity, and in that sense, being an entity, it has some reality. But with race, when I teach race and gender, it's the problem with race and gender is that they can be seen and perceived. You can call them in other ways. You can say, let's put quote unquote on race, let's do things with the word, let's deconstruct it, but that would not necessarily lead to, the change in perception. So with the problem with this reality of race, although I would always insist on skin color, is in the end, when you come to at the end of your wonderful talk, you say, let's introduce monstrosity. Let's live this monstrosity. And then I'm thinking, can we do it in any other way apart from accepting the differences? Tolerating the differences? So it's a very, what?
No, I'll explain in a minute.
Okay.
You wanted to have it registered?
It's just this is a kind of very minimal, very liberal kind of request.
Yeah.
But how do we really live monstrously with accepting the reality of the difference between the skin colors, the ways we dress, and I don't know what else. And I know I was too long, but I want to ask. My impression was that during the first part of your presentation, I wrote what Balibar said, but I wouldn't say that he's the only one. So the idea, when we explain racism, we tend to reify its logic. So that idea that when we talk about racism, we either mystify it, we either contribute to the mystification of it, or we theoretically enforce racism. How do we then critique racism? I didn't get. I would want to have this kind of very clear. I want to have. Sure. Of course. I'm asking the expert. Because we want to critique in order to have less violence and not more of it.
Okay, I was just smiling as well because we had the discussion over dinner yesterday, that's why, about the difference. But So what is real about race? Okay, I give you two examples. Maybe this is because I have worked a lot about it, and there's all these books about the history of race, and the invention of races, that for me it is less obvious that that there is a reality of races. Yeah. If you look at the history, of books like The Invention of the White Race in the US and how it came about, and this is not to say that we don't live race relations. I think we do live race relations, but we have to take into account that these races have been invented at some point in human history. Mm-hmm. So that means that before that point, people must have lived in different ways with each other. I'm not saying necessarily in better ways, but maybe not in race relation terms. Okay? The other instance is, of course, anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism has nothing to do with the color line. Mm-hmm. And of course, there are also people, the German fascists.
Just consider in between Judaism, Ashkenazi, and Sephardists, which were anti whatsoever, mutually. So there is something sort of different.
Yeah, no, it's fine.
There is something within the very discourse of anti-discourse that produces the argument of the other. What I wanted to say is and then when we thematize anti-Semitism, we go through self-hatred as well, somewhere, because that migrant Polish plumber coming to the United Kingdom, he is somewhere, he has it already when he moved from Poland or at his fringes of Poland and Russia, somewhere, to United Kingdom. What I wanted, when I reacted to what you said, is it came to me straight away, jus tollis and jus sanguis, the things that we inherited when we were talking about the assimilation, how is it possible, and then this is also a technique or a way of dealing with the otherness of someone moving from one soil to the other, or moving from one sideways to the other in these terms. And this is so correlated with gender issues.
Of course.
So,
this is
absolutely. That was there, because I thought of India, I thought of Africa, and a tiny episode of our daughter going there at 18 years old. She was 18 years old in Mali, and she said, well, we lived in the United States, and we saw all forms of different skin colors, but then she went there to Mali, and she said, I never ever faced that at that point racism, like between them, the nuances of the color. It's not white and black, it's nuances that produces the antagonism.
Sure.
So going back to the argument where we said we need a better, how we are going to formulate it. Well, and why anti-racism discourses are so fragile.
Yeah.
Well, so the argument is not good. Let's make it. Let's dig it into what could make it better. What is it that? And it's not only genealogy in the sense of discovering something behind the scene, and of course the things of our relations, but how we are going to approach it. And then I was smiling because I will talk about Condorcet and then the first abolition of slavery for the French Revolution. We had it even before all other abolitionist systems, and what they thought, how they think it for 3 years then. Same thing was they abolished slavery. The women were like equal, and then in 3 years' time, 5 years' time, everything just turned again into a terrible, racist, misogynist, whatsoever.
Yeah. Maybe because abolition of slavery is never something which leads necessarily to end racism in history.
Well, you know, that's a long story, but
yeah, it is actually, it is extremely complex.
Now you have two more questions, and then there's another one, and then I promise that I will stop.
No, it's okay. I can continue. I have no problem. No, I mean, how do you do this? I mean, this is such a, there's so many repertoires of this. But, you know, in very general ways, one of my favorite lines in Fanon is that he says at some point, the end of racism begins with a misunderstanding. Yeah? So sometimes it is helpful to just not understand. I mean, we have been discussing this yesterday, this desire to know. Yeah? And I think Fanon brilliantly basically responds to that without, you know, having written it much before, you know, that other book was written. But he responds to it in some ways, for me at least, in the way he says that, you know, the way racism makes sense of our world is exactly the way we have to make sense of the world in other ways, and that implies that we just don't understand, or we pretend not to understand, the racist explanation of the world. It is an explanation. It explains us the world. It makes us, you know, it's in a way of ordering the world for us, of organizing it, of knowing why, you know, these groups are superiors and the other are not, and why we are here and the others are there, and where they should be and where we are, and so on and so on. So this is, you know, this is the way racism explains us why this is. And so if we begin to say, I don't understand this, that's quite powerful, I have to say. Yeah, because, you know, the racists, they always go like, you know what I mean. You know? And then, you know, you can say, can you explain? I don't understand. What are you saying? And sometimes, in a very mundane, everyday life situation, it's extremely helpful, because you can see that they are then beginning to be unsecure. They don't really know how to explain it, and they know that if they begin to explain, they will use racist terminology, and they don't want to do this because most of the time they don't want to be openly racist. But of course, we can now see movements that are publicly, you know, like the alt-right and so on, that have become openly, publicly racist, who explain us the world by saying things like, you know, we should, you know, bring all black people back to Africa. I mean, openly, people like this guy Spencer are saying these things. You know, this is a reservoir for white people, and this is the reservoir for black people, and then, you know, they say all these, and it makes sense, you know, of course, it makes so much sense. It makes also, you know, this is what I explain to my students all the time, when, you know, they say, you know, racism in terms of migration is really also very easy. So, you know, there's not enough jobs, there's not enough housing, and there's not enough schools. And then if there are more people coming in, then of course there will be less of all of this. And it makes so much sense. This is, you know, this is logic, because it's a matter of resources. And they have an end. Resources always have an end. So, you know, you have to begin to explain that these resources are that they are distributed and organized in a way that, of course, we need to organize in different ways. But that poses other questions to how we live together than the races would like to have it. And it's and it's a very easy explanation. It's easy. You can understand that. And it makes sense. So if we seal off the borders, it will be more easy for all of us. It's incredibly to the point. No, seriously, because otherwise we have to ask ourselves much more complicated questions. And yes, this is what we need to do. We have to come up with different explanations of the world. Sorry.
No, okay. I'll just start. Thank you. It was very interesting. I had a question about something I was reading recently. I was reading public opinion analysis of the anti-immigration sentiment in the Dutch election. And there was this very interesting phenomenon that was registered that compared to the previous time, it didn't seem that the popularity of anti-immigration sentiments raised a lot. What rather happened is that it became more politically salient. So more people which previously already had this inclination and these preferences decided to vote basing their vote on that preference over all other preferences, economic or other items. So one question to you would be if you find this analysis convincing, if you think it can be applied to other countries in Europe, and what would this mean in the context of criticizing racism? Is this a relevant point? And then I had a second but slightly related question. So to what degree can the current rise of anti-immigration sentiment be attributed to economic anxiety in the working class and the raising of an economic divide? So these were two questions.
To begin with the last question. So this is a classic argument to explain racism, is to say that, there are different words for it. In the early 90s in Germany, you had the term Modernisierungsverlierer, which were those who were the ones who were unsuccessful in the process of modernization. Today we have the so-called Globalisierungsverlierer, those who are not successful in the process of globalization. And we have this is generally the enemy theory. So people who are excluded from social processes and so on and so on. And of course, this is a challenge for the left. Yeah? Because I would say this is the way a racist explanation makes sense of the world. So what do we do? Because, of course, there's poverty, there's impoverishment, there is a problem with the welfare state, there is a problem with housing, education, with health provision, etc., etc. And so how do we discuss these issues that have become all related to the question of migration? So, for example, in Germany, it's quite interesting. And if you look at the European Union polls, they have these things where they look at what is the biggest concerns of the European citizens. And for a long time, migration featured on the top of this rank. Yeah? So everyone was worried about migration. Okay? What does that mean? I mean, really, migration is not a problem. I think it's really not a problem. It can make a problem for a certain municipality and lack of resources, but in general, this can be organized, you know? So you have, for example, where was that? In Croatia, there's 600 immigrants. 600, okay? But registered, okay. Yeah, so let's make them twice as much. Let's be generous, make them, you know, twice as much. And then, you know, you explain again to me what exactly is this number and how can this be a complicate a society. Okay, I think you can enlarge this argument. In general, I think migration is not a problem for society. But you know, everything is discussed through the prism of migration. Everything. The question of housing, the question of education, everything. So what if we then begin to discuss all these questions by saying, can you re-articulate the problem without inserting the migrant as a problematic figure? What then is the problem that you see, and how can we approach it? Yeah? This is, I think, the problem is in general that we see at the moment politicians who are all not up to come up with solutions. Solution is not something that politics is about anymore, it seems. It's actually about creating more problems. But it's not, that's the problem. You know, if you would expect that politicians are there to actually see that, you know, there are certain things that need to be solved, and they don't do it. But what they create is more problems on different fronts, and these fronts are being acted against each other whenever, you know, there's need. But in terms of, you know, addressing, you know, conceptual problems of how we live together, you know, this the idea of Staatstheorie that once was there, I don't think any one of these people have ever an idea of, you know, the good conduct of government anymore, you know? I mean, I would wonder, I would be really interested if someone would conduct an empirical research into politicians and if they even have an idea of good conduct of government. You know, I mean, you know, I may oppose this idea of governance and so on, but I would like to hear if they have such an idea. I don't think so. I think that this is not it. But the interesting point is that in many of European societies, the migrant is the figure, the predominant figure, that I would even call a seismograph for the matters of democratization. So how much is a society ready to be democratic is the way they treat this figure of the migrant. And that's the thing. So I think this is the way, this is probably the only, and it's a very complicated way for the left to address this. So I think there is something that is right to these problems, but we have to distinguish them from the question of migration. The second is the question about the polls and how, you know, or the analysis of these voters. I think it's almost everywhere the same, and again, you know, this is because I really think this is because racist argumentation makes so much sense to people, and there's a weakness to reformulate it in other ways.
And also there is Monica's question. Can we hear Monica?
I'm fine. Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you. I wanted to come back a little bit to the question of the articulation between nationalism and racism. It made me think about nationalism when you said this formulation about racism against races, because in Spain, at least in the context that I know the most, nationalism is used as almost an euphemism for racism. We don't discuss race, race doesn't exist, it's like no. But we are openly racist, but for example, now with the conflict, nationalism, Spanish nationalism is rising, and now it has become we were openly racist, but now even more, from what I'm collecting from here, and everything disguised under the nationalism umbrella and paradigm. So how it is articulated as nationalism and racism. And then a quick question, when You mentioned the biopolitics also of racism, about the knowledge of populations that is constructed on these racist discourses. How can we think about this from the necropolitics perspective also? How is racism in Europe managing the deaths of the racialized others?
So, going back to the book that we've discussed yesterday, one of the simple, ways to distinguish racism and nationalism, I think, in the book is to say that basically nationalism is about the external other and racism is about the internal other. What do we do in a globalized world? And how is this newly articulated? And in terms of nationalism and racism, I think Catalonia would be an extremely interesting empirical case. And I think that, we were discussing this over dinner yesterday. So what is the quality of nationalism in this region in the 90s? And what is it today? I'm sure, it must be different. So what is it? Yeah. And then yesterday it was this, I think it was this psychoanalytic moment where everyone was like, this is about racism. And I thought this is interesting because in some ways it was like a revelation of the moment we bought into the idea of nationalism, we accepted that the others were outside of us and not internal. And that was the beginning of basically dissolvement, because if we had discussed this as racism, we would be able to think of it in terms of unity as the others in ourselves. And now comes my complete paradoxical intervention here. I think there's a lot of advantage to not think in terms of racism and race. Because if there is the opportunity to think of social relations not in terms of racism, we should keep that up as much as possible. Because when we begin to think of it as racism, we are in trouble. And I give you another example, which is also personal, is that, my daughter is the daughter of a father whose parents came from a Kurdish region in Turkey to Germany, and from a mother whose father came from a country that does not exist anymore, Yugoslavia. Okay, so now her name is not a German name, and she goes to a school in Berlin-Mitte, which is, a rather well-off neighborhood in Berlin. And so what we don't tell, we try as long as possible not to make her think that she is something different than the other kids in the school. Because if we would explain to her that she is different, she may think of herself as different and produce conflicts out of these differences. And if we want to undo these conflicts and therefore these differences, how long can we go on until the point where we have to open this problem up to her? And then how are we going to do it? I don't know, but this is the way we do it at the moment. We are not telling her that, she's in trouble. And she may not be, because we are hopeful she may not be. And there's a chance she may not be. We're well off. I'm working at the university. I can go to the school and say, my name is Professor so-and-so. She'll be treated differently because there's a class issue coming into that, So she may not. She may not. But I can tell you that there are schools in Berlin, Neukölln, or other places where the kids that go there, their life is organized around racism. And in very conflicting and contradictory ways. There are Palestinian people, there are Arabic people, there are Turkish people, there are black people, there are people from Asia, etc., etc. And the way they meet each other is organized by racist narrations. And the teachers, they are usually German, white people, and all of this is a very challenging moment in all of their lives. Okay? So, you know, these places are 2 kilometers from each other, and they are very different realities. So you don't even have to come up with the, you know, the examples of, you know, South Africa, UK, and so on. But actually, you know, this is in one city. So, I don't know. It's a problematic. The necropolitics, yeah, I mean, if you know, I mean, the Mediterranean is a complete necropolitical space. I mean, I know people who don't go to Greece for a holiday anymore because they are afraid that, you know, there will be a dead body at the beach. Seriously. So, yeah, you know, this is the price we pay when we live in this on this continent and in other places. Okay. Sorry, I have to be so pessimistic.
Yeah, we will end. Let's think of Neukölln as a wonderful place for a tourist.
No, I think you know this is also a place where this coexistence is practiced every day. It's not a dystopian place. You have to fight these things, of course. I mean, it's like, I'm not saying, you know, life is about struggle, but I'm saying, you know,
Life is about struggle.
yeah, somehow, I mean, we had this yesterday, but this discussion, if it should or not, should not be. But you cannot be naive about these antagonisms that actually exist. The question is, how do we undo them? That's the matter of, and there are different ways, and I think there are different ways in different situations, blah, 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 blah. So, there's no general answer to that.
Thank you. It was really, really, really inspiring.
Thank you for these fantastic questions.
Lasted for more than an hour.
Yeah.
I don't know if you're aware of that.
Yeah.
And thank you all for wonderful questions too.
And being here, although there's lava. Thank you very much.